Hey everyone. Do you enjoy valuetainment? This catchphrase comes from Patrick Bet-David, who in the last few years has amassed a pretty big following with his two YouTube channels. The Valuetainment channel has over 6 million subscribers, and the PBD podcast has over 2.5 million subscribers. Originally from Iran, he came to the US when he was a child, served in the military, and eventually started a marketing company that he later sold. And he now focuses mostly on his podcast. I won't go into too much detail on his old business, though an article in the Daily Beast and a video from CoffeeZilla have described it as a multi-level marketing company, which, in my opinion, is just a glorified pyramid scheme. PBD, as he likes to abbreviate himself, has published several business books, but today I'd like to instead talk about a novel he published in 2024 called The Academy. According to the author, it's been in the making for over 13 years. He describes it in a promo video like this.
If you're Armenian, if you're Syrian, if you're Persian, this is a book you're going to be reading and saying, holy moly, this is the kind of stuff you talk about in here? Yes. You get to sit down and watch and have a 3-4 hour conversation with Tupac. And it's also about how to prevent the end of civilization. But if I ever wrote a parenting book, this is the closest thing to it. I can't wait to read your reviews to see what you think about this book.
Clearly, there is a lot going on here. So let's dive into what happens in this book. The Academy is a thriller with some sci-fi elements. I'm not sure I could draw a direct parallel, but feel free to make some suggestions in the comments. It opens with a preface set in Iran in 1978, as the reign of the Shah came crashing down in the revolution. We meet two characters, Sargon and Namira, who we later learn are members of Savak, the Shah's secret police. They muse about what could have been done to prevent this upheaval, and we get a sense that these two men have competing philosophies on how to best run a country. The other thing we learn is that Sargon is in possession of some kind of list. Going to the first chapter, we flash forward to the present day where we meet our protagonist, Asher Yonan, an 18-year-old whose parents fled Iran to raise him in Glendale, California. He's of Assyrian descent. If you're familiar with the author of this book, you might realize that this guy sounds an awful lot like Patrick Bet-David. One thing that was strange in the preview video is that PBD described him as also being of Armenian descent.
This is a story about a character named Asher, who is half Armenian, half Assyrian.
I didn't actually notice that in the book at all, and a quick search shows that the word Armenia doesn't appear in the text once. Maybe he forgot to include that part. And yes, PBD is half Armenian. Here's how the book describes Asher as he rides his motorcycle. The helmet hid his olive-skinned face, a scruffy beard, and dark shadows under his large brown eyes. He was 18 years old, tall and fit. All his muscles taut now as he strained against the motorcycle. A few years back, he joined a boxing gym, marveled at the way his young body turned shredded from consistent work at the weights and in the ring. He loved the feel of his fists against the heavy bag, and even more against the headgear of his sparring partners. They told him not to come back until he could control his anger, so he'd never gone back. In addition to being a badass, we find out that Asher is constantly hooking up with women, and in a way where they know he's not using them for sex, so their feelings are never hurt, because he's such a great guy. And he has the potential to be even greater, something made painfully explicit in the book by many of the characters who show up. Here's how Asher's girlfriend talks to him. You're not the kind of person who just settles down for a quiet, normal life. That's not you. You might do something reckless and end up in jail, or worse, but I've always felt like you're going to do something great with your life. I mean, really great, like the sort of person people are going to learn about one day. A villain we meet later in the book says, beneath that rough exterior and aimless teenage life was a beating, pulsing heart full of the purest raw potential and power I had ever seen. And a mysterious stranger named Zaya tells him, the members of my organization feel you have a calling to do something great with your life, Asher. We want to help you find out what it is. So he is quite clearly a very exceptional boy. While this isn't unusual, since protagonists usually are characters of consequence in the story, because that's why they're the protagonist, the way everyone just presents this guy like he's just on the cusp of some great life is a bit over the top, and it would be more compelling if it somehow showed us his potential rather than having people just constantly remark how much potential he has. This exceptional boy does have one flaw though, he's constantly getting angry. Here's some examples. He was here, all but alone, angry at everything and unsure of where to turn. Asher would have laughed if he weren't so angry. For a moment, Asher felt a flush of anger. He felt an old, familiar anger rising up in him. He stood there in the middle of the room, confused and angry. Asher could feel an old, familiar anger begin to course through him. Asher felt himself filled with an unexpected anger. Asher felt a hot flash of something between anger and embarrassment. Asher sprang from the bed, suddenly full of rage. The fear was leaving him, replaced instead with anger. He could feel his anger at the man growing. Asher felt a familiar anger. Asher felt his chest grow hot with rage. Asher felt something inside him growing hot with fury. But now it filled Asher with white-hot anger. I'm pretty sure I didn't capture every single time Asher was angered or filled with rage or upset about something, but it's like he's the Hulk, except him getting angry never seems to help anything or hurt anything either. While reading this book, I kept expecting Asher's rage to lead to something, being unusually helpful or being something he needs to conquer and grow from. But it's just a trait he has that never really manifests in a meaningful way in the story. The most we get connecting his anger to the plot is that we find out his rage might have originated with his mother's poor treatment of him, particularly how she spoke about his father. But that too manifests itself in weird ways. There's one particular moment early in the book where Asher and his mother, Rose, are having a fight. I have to read this lengthy excerpt so you can get how strange this was. Asher and his mother are constantly arguing, and in this moment, she's really upset him and he's grabbed a hold of her to try and, well, you'll see. "Let go of me," his mother said. But instead, Asher took her hands, still clenched in fists, and started to hit himself across his face. "Hit me," he said. "Go on, hit me. Hit me harder. Does that feel good? Isn't that what you want?" "What are you doing?" Rose said. "What's wrong with you?" "Tell me who he is," he said, still hitting himself. By now, his mother's hands had gone limp as he held them. She was sobbing bitter tears and a choked sound coming from her. He let go of her, turned, and punched a hole in the drywall of the kitchen. "You're going crazy," she said, crumpling on the floor. "Just like your grandfather, you crazy fool. I cannot have you like this. Leave this house." This makes Asher sound pretty bad, though the book often reminds the reader early on that Rose is a terrible mother, getting drunk and living off of welfare. So I think we're meant to sympathize with Asher in this moment, even though we can recognize he's gotten a bit too far. Even so, it's a very weird scene. It is revealed later on that Asher's mother had hit him once, pretty badly, that he ended up in the hospital, which is why he was talking about getting hit. But it still reads very strangely. Asher's father, Odishu, is conversely presented as a saintly figure, and that's how he's presented through most of the book. He passed away when Asher was 12, but that doesn't stop him from having a lot of time in this book, as the first 14 chapters all end with flashbacks, dedicating a few pages to the last time Asher was with his father, as Odishu gives him a very long lecture about Iranian history. While I'm not an expert on the history of Iran, this lecture is very oddly pro-Shah. It downplays how hated the Shah was by the majority of the Iranian people, and outright says that his autocracy was a good thing. While I'm certainly not trying to defend the Ayatollah, he's a pretty bad guy too. The book presents kind of a false choice. To say the people of Iran were better off doesn't mean they were in a good place before the Islamic Republic was formed. Again, I'm not an expert. I think the Iranian people deserve the right to decide for themselves who their leader is going to be. Not that the book is necessarily arguing against democracy, it's just strangely supportive of the autocrat. There is a moment in these flashbacks where Asher's mother, Rose, pushes back on Odishu's glowing history of Iran in the 1970s. But again, the book is quick to let us know that she's not only a drunk, but also a communist, so she can't be fully trusted. The flashbacks end with Odishu dying in a car accident and Asher realizing he's going to have to live the rest of his life without his father. I'm not sure why it needed to be drip-fed at the end of all these chapters, but it's one of several strange choices that this narrative makes. In the present day, while visiting his father's grave, Asher is approached by a man named Dobail. The man gives Asher a card with his number, but feel free to forget about it because it doesn't come up again. We will see this character again much later on, which I do need to point out because a lot of characters tend to vanish in this book. When he's not being approached by strange men in graveyards, Asher spends time with his girlfriend, Kiki Johnson, who's described like this. Her father was black and her mother was Puerto Rican, and Asher thought she had the perfect warm skin tone. No one in her family knew where her piercing blue eyes came from, and both sides claimed credit for the perfect bubble butt. I think I physically winced when I read that this teenage girl's families are arguing where she got her perfect bubble butt from. Kiki isn't much of a character. Although Asher presents her as more meaningful than the other girls he's hooked up with, he never really explains why. She's described as being very beautiful, excelling in her studies, and a talented gymnast. All attractive qualities, sure, but Asher keeps saying that she's special without going beyond these features. It reads more like a defense of Asher, so we won't think he's a shallow guy, much in the way he has apparently been ethically hooking up with a lot of other women. Not that Kiki matters a whole lot because she leaves the story a few chapters in and Asher finds himself a new love interest. She does get mentioned later on in the book, but it often feels like not Asher, but the author trying to come to grips with the fact that the protagonist is being kind of a jerk, ignoring this perfectly lovely girlfriend he has for an opportunity with someone else. Early in the story, Asher feels like his life has no real direction. He had dropped out of high school, and the only plan he had for his future was to get on his motorcycle and ride around aimlessly to find a life for himself. Before that starts, he goes to the fast food place he worked at to pick up his final check and ends up in the middle of a robbery. Although he planned on laying low at first, eventually Asher takes action when one of the robbers makes a move on an employee there. The gunman sounds an awful lot like a cartoon character. "What do you say you and me get out of here, huh?" the gunman said to Lauren. "I take you on a date. A real nice one. Not in a dump like this. Trust me, I've got the money for it." Though he's only got his father's unloaded gun, Asher bluffs his way to saving Lauren. And in spite of his heroism, the cops take him into custody because the gun isn't registered to him. Although it looks like Asher is heading to prison, he's escorted out of police custody by a mysterious stranger named Zaya. Zaya is a recruiter for the Academy, a special organization that takes in bright, promising youths and trains them to be the superstars of the future, leading the world in politics, business, entertainment, and other fields. Asher, with nothing really to lose, decides to take him up on that offer to join. Zaya, by the way, is another character you can forget about because when he drops Asher off at the Academy, he more or less exits the story. The Academy is a large campus outside of Dallas. It uses some kind of special technology to keep it hidden from sight so no one can interfere with the studies going on inside. Asher is initially very impressed at the scale of this operation. We meet some of the fellow apprentices who make up Asher's friend group. There's Boris, a nerdy guy who befriends Asher right away. Zahi, another early friend for Asher who is athletic and religious. Brody, a nerdy girl who's into computers. And Cassandra, who is very beautiful, and Asher is immediately attracted to her. She only seems to be part of the friend group because Asher needs a love interest. If you're wondering about the time gap right here, early in the morning, Asher had left Kiki after they'd spent the night together in a small town, and by what seems to be the afternoon, he is in Dallas and flirting with Cassandra. And this is explained away because Asher got the feeling Kiki was ready to end things because she's going to college on the East Coast. So I guess it's not a big deal that he's drooling over Cassandra less than 24 hours after he last saw his girlfriend. Each of these Academy students seems more accomplished than Asher, whose only real impressive deed so far has been stopping that robbery. Asher struggles with this feeling of inadequacy as the story goes on, but it never quite builds to the point where it gets interesting. One of the first things Asher is given at the Academy is a special cube. It's an ID card, a key card. It can guide people through the campus. It can receive and send text messages, and it can look up old articles for research purposes. It's pretty much just a smartphone, though a special one because it's a cube and it floats. This cube has some kind of ridiculous power source that is at first a mystery. It also has this kill switch device called a blink that disables all the tech around the Academy. The book vaguely suggests part of this technology might be alien, or at least it didn't come through scientific research, but rather a discovery at some old temple. It never really makes any of this explicit because I think it's being set up for a future book. All prospective apprentices have to go through 3 tests to be accepted into the Academy. The tests represent wisdom, strength, and courage. The wisdom test is being able to figure out a basic number pattern and not getting psyched out that the answer is so simple. The third test, courage, has people strapped to a chair where they're given a VR headset and forced to face their worst fears. For Asher, his worst fear is letting down his dead father. The second test, strength, is the more interesting of the 3 as it introduces the ridiculously named Traitor Ball. I'm not entirely sure how this sport works because it's not very well explained, but from what I could gather, it involves one player forming a team by selecting teammates, and the remaining players form the opposition. The bigger the opposition team is, the more valuable goals become. One wrinkle is that the teammates of the player who chose his team can change sides, throwing off the game's balance. It really centers the experience of the very first player who chose others to join his team, with everyone else just revolving around that person. Although it only becomes clear later on, the game of Traitor Ball reflects a big part of this book's philosophy. that the events of this story very much play to the great man theory of history. That's a reading of history where singular individuals are believed to have shaped the course of events more so than the circumstances of that era. The Academy is basically set up to try and create these great men. By tying an institution to these great men, it really throws a monkey wrench into the whole great man theory. After all, these people are being shaped by an institution. So if anything, it would be this institution that's responsible for world events in the future. But the book doesn't really grapple with this incongruity, possibly because it so internalizes the great man theory that it just takes the whole thing for granted. One of the big issues with great man theory is it almost mythologizes these singular individuals, attributing to them a level of insight and accomplishment that often exaggerates what one single person is capable of. As an example from the book, during the Trader Ball game, we see several holograms taking part representing famous athletes. There's Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, and other sports figures. Although the figures all come from different sports and none of them would know what Trader Ball is, their greatness is so transcendent that they all know how to play this new game together at a high level. A look at Michael Jordan's baseball career should give everyone an idea of how one person may excel at one sport but not another, and that these guys have very specialized athletic skills, so putting them on the same team for a sport no one's ever played does not guarantee they would be good at it. But historical figures in this book have this mythic greatness that's applied to them, and we have many more to meet. Also, before moving on, I know holograms can't really play sports because they're light projections, and the book mostly plays by those rules. For some reason in this chapter, it just forgot that holograms don't work that way. To say more about these holograms, though, early in the story, Asher passes by a billboard for World Corp, this giant corporation in the book, and they would project holograms of Plato and other historical figures to advertise their company. I don't know what this company is supposed to be advertising, but they are the giant corporation behind the Academy, or rather, a corporate front for the Academy. They're also the wealthiest corporation in the world, so the Academy has very deep pockets. The holograms in this book are almost entirely famous figures in history, some living, most of them dead. More than just projections, they're meant to be recreations of these important figures with personalities shaped by AI, capable of interacting with others as a convincing simulation of these famous people. After Asher gets through the testing phase, he learns that the lessons at this school involve attending classes taught by these holograms, each one of them imparting whatever subject the book tells us they have expertise in. For example, a hologram of Marilyn Monroe teaches the apprentices about seduction, and she's joined by Cleopatra, Frida Kahlo, a non-specific Chinese princess from the Han Dynasty, Helen of Troy, and Lancelot. The holograms have reams of biographical data informing them, which supposedly makes them lifelike, though you might have noticed some of these characters aren't real people, so at first I assumed these holograms also used fictional stories to create these personalities. However, we later find out that part of the special sauce for these holograms is that the DNA of each subject is used as a framework for an artificial brain. Putting aside that the book doesn't understand how DNA works, where would someone find the DNA for Lancelot or Helen of Troy? Later on, we see lectures on economics from Karl Marx and Margaret Thatcher. This conversation is incredibly tedious as Marx more or less lectures everybody, while Thatcher engages in dialogue with the students who find Marx compelling. Asher, being our hero, and this book being by Patrick Bet-David, finds a lot of flaws in Marx's side in this debate. Here's an example where Asher and Cassandra are arguing on the role of business in society. "I mean it," Cassandra continued. "Why couldn't it be the government doing all of that? Or professors in universities doing research to drive technology forward? That's happening already, before others swoop in to take all the money and credit for their hard work." "You really think it's only business people who are selfish?" Asher said. "I don't know about you, but I trust them a lot more than politicians. At least the business people are honest about what they're doing and why they want to do it. Politicians just want more and more power to control people." As we live in a time when the world's wealthiest man has usurped control of the American federal government, it's strange to read exchanges like these, and it reflects the weird trust the book places in business in general. Also, going back to the preview video, PBD presented this debate a bit differently.
You can set up a debate between Karl Marx and Ayn Rand. Karl Marx is in the book, who wrote Communist Manifesto. Ayn Rand, who wrote Atlas Shrugged, is in the book.
Does he not remember it was Margaret Thatcher who debated Marx in this book and not Ayn Rand? There's a whole chapter dedicated to this whole event. In fact, Ayn Rand's hologram only gets mentioned once in the book, where she's teaching a class on using art to make political arguments. It seems weird that he forgot that. I mentioned a little earlier how time in this book is a little odd. Asher went through drifting through life to stopping the robbery to joining the academy, all in about a day. When he joins the academy, things seem slightly less squished together, which is an improvement, but everything still seems like it's on fast forward. For example, the Marx Thatcher lesson ends after a single lecture, and the apprentices are then tasked to debate the opposite side they supported during the lecture, one they have to research and present the very next day. And then we never hear from the Marx or Thatcher holograms again. Was this class a single lecture and a research project? And this was the most detailed class we get in the book. Everything else is described in passing as a subject with a famous person attached to it. The whole experience seems superficial. Outside of the classroom, Asher is getting messages from a mysterious admirer who is impressed by Asher's progress. And he's trying to plant seeds in Asher's mind that the academy isn't quite as good as it looks. Also in his free time, Asher and Boris sneak through the tunnels under the campus to figure out a way to make holograms of their own. Asher wants to make one of his father. The lessons continue and we hear from Tupac Shakur about control and deception, and you might wonder who would offer the natural counterpoint to Tupac? Well, it's none other than a hologram of Hitler. While he seems like a bad idea for a teacher, it's presented as learning from people you disagree with, which is fine in theory. It's just very jarring to see these two juxtaposed, mostly because it doesn't really make any sense. Here's an example of what Hitler teaches the apprentices. The most difficult type of nation to control is one that believes in a higher power. A nation that has faith and hope is a difficult nation to control. It's almost satirical, as if religion hasn't been used as a means of controlling people. A famous modern example you'd think the book would go to is Iran, since it looms so heavily in the background. But I'm not sure PBD is ready to make a connection like that. As the lessons proceed, the text starts to fail. At first, the instructor thinks it's the blink devices everyone has been given, but we later find out Boris has been messing with stuff underground on his own. As the tech continues to fail, Asher eventually goes with Boris to one of the deeper chambers underground to find a quantum computer that's powering everything. Asher had brought along an old shirt that belonged to his father so they could make a hologram of him because his father's DNA was on that shirt, but something goes wrong and Asher is incapacitated for a moment. We find out that Boris is actually a spy for one of the school's enemies, and he escapes with a special black cube that can be used to create holograms. Asher gets permission from the academy director to chase Boris down. The director trusts Asher because he's got so much potential, and he's also revealed to be Sargon from the book's preface. He's Asher's grandfather, which is probably a better explanation for how Asher got into the academy than his supposed greatness. Asher finds Boris in Dallas, and we find out that he's working for Namira, the other guy from the preface. Namira is also Dobiel, the guy Asher met in the graveyard back in the first chapter. He's also the admirer who's been sending Asher messages. Oh, and the robbery that Asher foiled to impress the academy, that was staged by Namira. And he's also the guy who murdered Asher's father. Namira is a lot of guys in this book. We learn a bit more about the rivalry between Namira and Sargon, although they were both members of the Shah's secret police, an organization that was accused of various acts of murder and torture used to silent dissent. Sargon is apparently one of the good ones, while Namira is one of the bad ones. Probably because Sargon is a product of the academy, and for some reason he told Namira about it. Now Namira wants to destroy the academy by exposing it to the world. To do that, he needs the black cube Boris stole because it can be used to create holograms, and he needs Sargon's DNA so he can reveal the list of every academy member of the world. He was hoping to use Asher's father's DNA, thinking that would be a good substitute, but apparently not. You need Sargon's DNA. Anyway, that's why Asher was part of this whole plot. If you're wondering why Namira hates the academy, he describes it like this. Imagine the benefit to the rest of the world if their technology was shared rather than hoarded behind dozens of shell companies and corporate obfuscations designed to keep everything hidden in secret, Namira said. All of humanity could make such an amazing leap into the future if only these breakthroughs could be pried from the Cabal's grasp. It's very sensible and should make you wonder who the villain truly is here. It's hard to describe, but the book just does not present this guy as credibly not a villain. Part of it is knowing that he's a murderer and the fact that he is also operated in secret. And aside from the messages coming from the admirer, the academy is constantly presented as this obvious force for good in the world. Although Asher doesn't fully trust Namira, the promise of seeing his holographic father is enough to get him to sneak back into the academy and go after Sargon's DNA. Although at this point Asher is clearly playing a double game and is going to betray Namira later on. When Asher gets to the academy, he tells Sargon about the plot and that he has a plan to turn the tables on Namira. Cassandra joins Asher when he goes to confront him. Because he's the villain, Namira is revealed to not just want to expose the academy, but also to take over the world. His plan is that revealing the academy's existence would create chaos, and then using advice from holograms like Sun Tzu and other figures the book doesn't mention, Namira would then conquer the world. I don't really know how this plan would work, and we don't get much more detail than that, but this is what he's trying to do. This plot, aside from not making a lot of sense, also never really would have worked, since there's a moment where Asher is reunited with his hologram father, and he realizes that this technology is not quite as powerful as he first imagined. Although the hologram looks and sounds like his father, the interactions aren't convincing to someone who actually knew Odishu. The hologram is a pale imitation of the real thing. It kind of undercuts much of this book. If the holograms aren't suitable replacements, how would Namira's plan ever worked if it relied on their wisdom? And how are the lessons of the academy worthwhile if these holograms are so limited? It's almost as if this whole premise is a sham. The book, as usual, doesn't really grapple with this question. It just kind of moves on. Instead, we get a contrived action sequence where Asher shoots a fastening on an air duct to drop it on Namira, while Cassandra uses a blink device to disable the black cube. Boris is shot and killed in the fracas, and Namira escapes to fight another day. Afterwards, the apprentices all graduate. I'm not sure how far into the future this is, but it really just seemed to last a few months, so I guess the curriculum is very short. I guess you don't need much time when you have holograms of Wayne Gretzky, an unnamed Chinese princess, and Hitler teaching you. And what was this great destiny that was awaiting Asher? Well, he'll be traveling the world hunting down threats to the academy, going after folks like Namira. There's something chilling about his great destiny being upholding this secret system that promised him greatness when really it was upholding its own secret structure. And so our time at the academy comes to an end. But I want to talk about this school a little bit more. I didn't really get into this, but there are many branches of the academy. It's a series of schools designed to create historically important figures, and it's being repeated around the world. Usually in these stories, it's these large systems impress conformity on people, and we need young newcomers like Asher to come and upend the system to give people the freedom to choose how they're going to shape their lives and the world around them. The academy unironically presents this controlling force as a good thing, actually. At one point, Asher reflects on how the academy controls people in a way that is for the best. By the way, in this, I'm going to read an excerpt and I'm going to mention Cicero. This is actually Asher's teacher, who is a real guy. It's not a hologram of the actual Cicero. They heard viewpoints from all different sides with the historical instructors, and Cicero made a big deal out of everyone thinking for themselves. But over and over, the same kind of thinking was held up as a paragon, the strong, free individual striving to maintain their rights. The concept of individualism isn't a very full ideology, but it's also something that could be said to describe any post-secondary school in North America. Colleges and university produce graduates as individuals, many, depending on what their course load was, with an understanding of human rights. The lessons at the academy don't really resemble a college or university, though, because they focus more so on tactics rather than theory, like how to avoid being seduced or how to spot propaganda. Deeper questions on rights aren't really explored. Even the debate on economics I mentioned earlier doesn't get much further than a grade school level understanding of the topics. The academy is just a more convoluted version of higher education, of existing colleges and universities, but with a poor education and compulsory gym classes where people play one of the most absurd sports I've ever heard of. And I'm not sure why this school has to be a secret. If the threat is people like Namira, then the only weapon he has is revealing these schools to the public. If they weren't a secret, the threat would vanish. And there already are schools that are basically elite institutions where people make connections that will greatly benefit them in the future. It could be that the academy is a big metaphor for what Ivy League schools are in the United States, but it's strange that it exists in a world where Ivy League schools are already a thing. It's an institution placed on top of an institution that already exists. And the Academy's holograms, aside from the fact that they're not very convincing, are underwhelming from the very get-go. We didn't need Asher's revelation to tell us that these holograms aren't a substitute for a proper education. They don't offer much more than what you would get from reading a book in a proper school. One of the great things about going to a college or university is seeing how these ideas have evolved and changed over time, as many other academics have grappled with them. The novel is stuck in this concept of great man theory that it misses out on how many of these figures aren't the final word on the subjects they lecture on, even if they pioneered it themselves. That's one of the neat things about education. It builds on itself and keeps improving. It's not an edict that is delivered from on high and then never challenged again. Karl Marx is not the final and only word on his subject. Neither is Sigmund Freud or Charles Darwin or many of the other influential thinkers who have appeared throughout history. Also, if the Academy is kept secret because they want to hide their technology from the world, why are the holograms being put on billboards? People can see they exist. They're clearly there out in the world. And the Academy does a terrible job of keeping everything hush-hush. During the graduation ceremony, each of the apprentices, I guess now graduates, are allowed to invite 2 guests. So a lot of people just invite their family to this big party at the Academy. I don't know, do all these people just get sworn to silence? Clearly thousands of people have gone through the Academy. How is this being kept secret? How is nobody just not spilled the beans on social media somewhere? It seems strange. The end of the book has a long acknowledgement section. I really like this one anecdote PBD shared about the name Asher. A day after I finally decided the name of the main character was going to be Asher, I met a family who named their son Asher with the same exact spelling, yet they weren't Assyrian. On the same day, I met another man named Asher who also wasn't Assyrian. The person who helped most with this book, Mario Aguilar, was present at both of those moments. We both looked at each other stunned about the timing of this. That's the whole story, by the way. He named his character Asher and then ran into 2 people with that name who weren't Assyrian. I guess that's supposed to mean something, I'm not sure what. PBD claims that his life experience was the inspiration for this book, which is incredibly obvious. I think the holograms are meant to be manifestations of his many influences over the years, which really makes me wonder how Hitler got into the mix. But maybe that was added in for effect because I doubt he was seriously influenced by Helen of Troy or Lancelot. But looking at all the figures who are name-checked throughout this book, and here's a brief list, aside from a few of them, most of these are just cameos. It might have been more compelling had their influence been explored instead of treating them like celebrities who just show up, dazzle us with their name and their supposed subject expertise, and then we never hear from them again. It reminds me of someone who might buy a lot of books by fancy authors and then takes pride in displaying them on the shelf, but has nothing to say about the actual contents of those books and what they found interesting within them. It's great to say you've read War and Peace, but do you have anything to say about this book and Tolstoy's understanding of how we read history? The style of writing of this book is probably clear from the excerpts I chose, but to say a bit more about it specifically, it is a very dry read. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of style, and it often feels more like reciting events than trying to evoke anything in the minds of the reader beyond the concrete places and people it describes. Personally, I actually prefer a more straightforward style, particularly if it's an amateur writing, because the more elaborate a writing style is, the more difficult it becomes for someone without much experience to do it. And to be fair, when it's in the hands of a master, it's lovely to read books that are written with a really elevated style. But going back to this book, it very much reads like someone who considers their words purely for their most basic function. Here's an example of a random paragraph I selected. Asher stood and looked once more at the director. He could feel his anger at the man growing. This person knew something about his father and his death. He needed to know what that was. It's very simple to understand that, but it's not very interesting to read. It's telling you what it's trying to say without saying it in a way that is evocative of anything other than the literal meaning of the words. As a contrast, I took about 30 seconds to rewrite this paragraph. Here's something that's, I think, a little more interesting. Asher stood, his eyes fixing on the director as he felt his muscles tense. The director knew something about his father's death, and Asher was going to find out what that was. Here, I decided to use fewer sentences and describe the actual physical sensations of Asher's body, giving the reader a more subtle feeling they can connect to instead of saying he's getting angry. When I mentioned earlier how Asher is always getting angry and the book describes him as such, It's not just the character I'm talking about in that moment. I'm also making an observation on the style. It's one thing to have a character get angry constantly throughout the book, but if you're just saying, this character got angry, this character got angry, it makes it sound flat, like it's the same anger hitting him every single time. It lacks subtlety. And maybe Asher is just getting angry the exact same way in every single instance, but that's just not an interesting character. What I'm trying to show is that the writing of this book is so plain and devoid of character. It feels like anyone could have written this book. This, coupled with the fact that PBD seems to have forgotten certain elements within the book, makes me wonder how attached he was to the writing process. He said it took him over 13 years to put this together, so it's quite possible that he just forgot about stuff as he was writing. And I do believe he wrote it himself. It seems like along the way, much of the author's personality just never manifested itself within the text. Or maybe PBD just loves this very bland writing style. And this speaks to one of the tragedies of this book and how unconsidered it was. It reads like a very long plot summary, and more time seems to have been spent on that plot and how it fits together than actually trying to evoke anything within the reader. There are brief moments where the prose gets a bit better, but it is so inconsistent and often falls flat that the experience never really moved me in any way. And even with all the consideration for this book going towards its plot, the characters fall flat and there are several plot holes that are genuinely distracting. And I say this as someone who doesn't get too obsessive about plot holes because I think in a lot of times people can get a little too nitpicky and fixated on minor details that ultimately don't matter. But when there are several problems with the central premise of the series, that's going to fall flat for me. There's a phrase I once heard that captures this book elegantly. There's a book inside of everyone, and most of the time it should stay in there. As a final thought on the book, it could have been very interesting to see a school that is usually presented as an inherently bad thing in most books and movies, secretly training the people who will run the world. Presenting that as a good thing might have been kind of cool and interesting and different, but this novel is not the one to do it. It's a shame because I like when books, movies, TV shows, or some other thing try to turn a premise on its head, but you need a level of skill and talent to pull that off in a way that's genuinely compelling or entertaining or any of the things that this book simply isn't. If you're curious in reading it, I strongly recommend you don't and instead read, anything else. One thing you can do aside from reading this book is check out some more of my videos on this channel, and you can support me by becoming a member on my Patreon or a YouTube channel member. You'll get your name in the credits like these lovely folks, early access to videos, and fun little bonuses I throw in every now and again. If you'd like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this video on social media. If you don't know what to comment, try thinking up a book or movie or TV show that most resembles the plot of The Academy. The premise was a little too generic for me to link it to any other specific title, but maybe there's one out there I've never heard of that fits this series like a glove and is hopefully better. Thank you all so much for watching.